Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gornitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we'll be reading from Canto 10, chapter 43, and there are two texts for today, text 34 and text 35. So just give me a minute here. Okay, so we'll chant text 34 together. Nityam pramudita gopa vatsa palayata sputam vaneshu mala yudena kridantas charayantika Nityam pramudita gopa vatsa palayata sputam vaneshu mala yudena kridantas charayantika Nityam pramudita gopa Vatsapalayata sputam Vaneshu mala yudhena Kridantas charayantika. Please chant. Nityam pramudita gopa Vatsapalayata sputam Vaneshu mala yudhena Kridantas charayantika. Nityam pramudita gopa Vatsapalayata sputam Vaneshu mala yudhena Kridantas charayantika. Nityam pramudita gopa Vatsapala yatasputam Vaneshu mala yudena Kridantas charayantika. And the word for word, nityam, always. Pramudita, very happy. Gopa, cowherds. Vatsapalaha, tending the calves. Yatasputam, obviously. Vaneshu, in the various forests. Malayudena, with wrestling. Kridanta, playing. Charayanti, they graze. Ga, the cows. It's got a very onomatopoeic quality, that particular word. And the translation for text 34 is as follows. It is well known that cowherd boys are always joyful as they tend their calves, and that the boys playfully wrestle with each other while grazing their animals in the various forests. And purport, so translation and purport is by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. Here, Chanura explains how the two brothers came to be expert at wrestling. And then text 35, I will read the Sanskrit and the translation. Tasmat rajna priyam yuyam vayam cha karavana he bhutani na prasidanti sarva bhuta mayo nirpaha. And the translation is, therefore, let's do what the king wants. Everyone will be pleased with us, for the king embodies all living beings. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapsa Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshvari Vishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyas Chakripa Sindhubhe Vichapatitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha. Namom Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimata Roma Padaswami iti namine Namom Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimata Bhaktivedanta Swami iti namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. There's a commentary on text 34 by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. So text 34 again. So this is Chanura addressing Krishna. And he has been addressing Krishna. Yesterday's class by Subal was the introduction to his train of thought. And now he's coming to a point where he's giving, and here's the purport from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. He explains how Krishna, here Chanura, this is quoting from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, here Chanura explains how Krishna and Balaram became expert at wrestling. It's a one-line purport. So he's, in some sense, giving some justification for their ability to wrestle, because the mood with which he was speaking was painted in yesterday's class. And I'm going to proceed through a long examination of what he's saying, and only after some time will I get into his mood. But I think it's necessary to look at what the truth of the matter is, so to speak. So Chanura is making a generalization. And his generalization is that cowherd boys are always joyful as they tend their calves. And this is borne out by the following description. And this description is from a book from the 1500s. It's one of Lord Chaitanya's contemporaries, Srila Kavi Karnapura. The book is entitled Ananda Vrindavan Champu, and it's extremely beautifully written, extremely beautiful. So here's his description that bears out this statement being made by Chanura, that the cowherd boys are always joyful when they're tending their calves. So here's a description. Krishna absorbed himself in sporting with his friends and calves. For a long time, Mother Yasoda curiously watched the boys play and wander behind the calves. Driving the calves forward, Krishna walked behind. As peacocks dance jubilantly at seeing a monsoon cloud and leg-bound lotuses open to drink the sun rays, Mahadev, Brahma, Indra, and other self-satisfied demigods hid behind the clouds to view the breathtaking pastimes of Krishna. Lord Brahma was especially enthusiastic to witness the festival of Krishna's taking out the calves. So this is just setting the scene. So I'm going to continue with Srila Kavi Karnapura, because it's to paint the whole picture of the joyfulness of the cowherd boys. Whenever Krishna sped ahead to a distant place, the cowherd boys scurried behind, shouting excitedly, "I will touch him first." "Oh, no, you won't. I will touch him first." And upon reaching Krishna, they impelled him to choose the winner. The cheeks and lips of the Lord bathed in the nectar of his broad smile as he responded to his friends. "It does not matter who got here first, because somehow you have come here and met me." So this is Krishna's response. So this is all part of the joyful atmosphere. So I'm continuing. While rambling through the forest, one boy stole another boy's lunch package and passed it to a third. And when the boy discovered his lunch bag stolen, he tried to retrieve it. But the thief would throw it to another. After stealing someone's lunch bag, they quickly took some food from it and replaced it with their own. The boy who lost his food smiled upon getting it back. So there's no feeling of what would happen in the material world of getting upset and being a little bit bothered and examining what's come back, and it isn't quite the same as it was when it had left one's hand. I don't really like this preparation. Nothing like that. He's actually smiling. It's all very joyful. Some boys snatched each other's horns, flutes, or herding sticks. One boy stole a second boy's gunjamala, and then a third boy would steal the mala from the second, and then a fourth boy took it from the third. Finally, after a short time and a few scuffles, so, remember Chanura is talking about the wrestling of the cowherd boys, but this is their play. So they're merely getting into a scuffle. All the boys recovered their personal belongings. In this way, Krishna's friends enjoyed the festival of stealing. So this is on a daily basis, and it's called a festival because a festival means everybody's involved, and there's like group activity, and it's extremely joyful. It's got a celebratory nature. So you can understand Chanura is using the correct terminology by referring to these activities of the cowherd boys as joyful. So this is what I'm trying to bear out, that his statement is correct from that point of view. So I'm continuing from Srila Kavi Kannapura. While the calves grazed in distant places, remember he said the calves graze in different forests. So while the calves grazed in different places, in distant places to relish fresh green grasses, the gopas leaned their poles against the trees and rested in the shade with Krishna. Then, for the pleasure of Krishna, they invented various games. Seeing an intoxicated peacock nearby, the boys mimicked his jerky neck movements, contracting their bodies in funny poses. They attempted to imitate the ducks sitting in the marsh. I mean, one can't imagine. I mean, there's certainly when you think of yoga asanas and some of the yogic poses, there can be odd movements, like there's a particular pose that I do on a regular basis because it relieves any tension that comes in the lower back, and since we live in a tension-filled world, you have to counteract this and help the body along. So it's a pose where the head is upward, the torso is sort of slanted like this, and the legs stick out way into the back. So, one's like floating in the air. So in this particular case, the boys are imitating a duck sitting in the marsh. So it's a similar kind of thing, there's the back goes upwards. So some boys played with frogs. And when the frogs jumped in the water, the boys immediately dove in after them. So they have been very much at one with the other living entities that are in the spiritual world. When birds flew overhead, the boys ran after their shadows on the ground, trying to follow their exact courses. So, if you see a flock of birds in the sky, generally it's a very ordered formation. It's a kind of triangle that's formed, and they keep the same distance apart. So one can just imagine the boys. I mean, at least this is how I'm seeing it, because it's usually that formation. One can imagine the boys forming that kind of formation, then trying to follow that perfectly ordered course that birds have. And there's usually just one at the very front. So it's a lot of awareness of nature, a lot of awareness of the body shapes, imitating the movements, even getting so subtle as, if the creatures in the air are trying to follow the shadows. So very subtle understanding, very subtle play. They scared the monkeys, and this is very amusing, by exactly imitating their facial expressions and pulling the tails. So recently, one of the devotees or couple in the Nepal community, they'd had a child, and we had been considering what would be an ideal gift for this child. And we stood for a long time looking at some stuffed toys, and we were considering an octopus or a monkey. And so we sat and we thought, no, the monkey has a better face. A monkey is probably going to be more fascinating to a child. And indeed, when you hear the cowherd boys, they're also finding the monkeys very interesting from the point of view of trying to imitate their facial expressions, and they pull the tails. And it just so happened that the grandmother of this little boy that we'd decided on the monkey toy for, and for whom we purchased that toy, sent us a video. And the little child, the stuffed monkey was sitting there, and the little child started going towards the monkey, and the first thing the child did was to pull the tail. So it seems it's part of the play, a very natural instinct. Now, when the monkeys climbed the trees, the boys followed and jumped with them. Some boys sang and danced with exaggerated steps, while other boys laughed at their antics. So this is painting a picture by Srila Kavi Karnapura of the very joyful atmosphere, the very joyful exchange between the cowherd boys. So now looking at Chanura's explanation of how the boys came to be expert at wrestling. So he's naturally, well, I'll come to his mood in a little while, but he's giving an explanation for how they came to be wrestling, or expert at wrestling. So it means that the boys, they would playfully wrestle with each other while grazing their animals in the various forests. And here's the description. So we go into the actual source of how it looks like. In a melodious tone, Krishna called the Gopas, "Ho, ho, my brothers, now stop your dancing, because we're going to play a new game." While running to meet their friends, the Gopas replied, "Oh, Damodar, what sort of game do you want to play?" Krishna said, "Listen, let us divide ourselves into two parties. One party will go with the powerful Balaram, and the other party will side with me." Thus, Krishna divided his friends into two parties in order to hold a contest of strength. The boys in Balaram's party followed him like loyal bodies, and the other boys accompanied Krishna. The losing party had to carry the victors on their backs. Krishna's party lost. And even though Krishna carries the whole universe in his belly, he had to carry Sudama on his shoulders. So that's one description of the kind of wrestling that's going on while the calves are grazing, because the calves tend to follow where the grass is greenest. We regularly pick up milk from some farmers that are coming from Wisconsin. And I often ask the farmer a simple question, how are the cows? And as soon as I ask the question, the man lights up. And he's a silent fellow, he doesn't say anything. But the minute he gets asked this question, he lights up and he tells me, yes, now we have them sheltered because it's getting a bit cold. So then I ask him, so what are they eating now? So he said, some of the things we've prepared for them. So then I asked him, do they like that? So he said, well, no, the only thing they really like is when the grass is tender and green, their new shoots. Hare Krishna. So he understands the preferences that the cows and the calves have for the particular kind of grass. He's very sensitive to that. And so there's the same kind of description here, that the calves and the cows, they're looking for that kind of favorite grass. It's like looking for your favorite foodstuff. They're looking for their favorite foodstuff. And it's while that is going on that the boys are engaging in this kind of contest of strength. Now, there's a most interesting conversation that takes place between Lord Balaram and Krishna when Lord Balaram, and this is happening at the time of this one of these contests of strength, it's one of the regular pastimes. Lord Balaram is suddenly amazed because there's an extraordinary power in the person who's carrying him on his shoulders. And that being at that time was Pralambasura, who's called the deceitful one, because he had disguised himself as a cowherd boy, and he'd entered into the same contest of strength. So here's the conversation that happens with Balaram. He instantly understands what's happened. So he calls out to his playful younger brother, "Oh, Damodar, hey, Manorama, just as insanity robs one's intelligence, this demon is trying to kidnap me. Oh, you of infallible willpower, what should I do now? Oh, relisher of mellows." So you can see the complete bravado and confidence that Balaram displays. He understands he's on the shoulders. He's being carried by a very powerful demon. And this is how he addresses Krishna. And he's insulting the demon by saying, just as insanity robs one's intelligence, this demon is trying to kidnap me. So basically calling the demon an insane fellow. And, it's like he's throwing it out to Krishna, what should I do? And without hesitating any longer, please give me proper instructions. So one can understand that mode of goodness, that complete detachment in that particular scenario. He's understanding the situation, but he can be so detached that he can say to Krishna, give me proper instructions. And Krishna felt somewhat amused to see and hear all this. Then in a thundering voice, he assured Baladev, these are Krishna's words, give up all your fears. As though Balaram had any fear. Why are you submitting to illusion? Just remember your own divine power and slay the demon. Yes. It's the beauty of these pastimes is extraordinary because of that incredible all-knowingness that gives this beautiful simplicity and confidence in the expressions and the delightful beauty of the interactions that are just so open-hearted. So one thing that emerges from this description that I've been reading to you is that Krishna has a definite position in relation to the treatment of devotees and atheists. And this position is actually, in Bhagavad Gita, we find Arjuna praising this position because in a different setting, so he's not, at this precise moment when he does this praise, he's not seeing Krishna in his two-handed form, he's seeing Krishna in his universal form, where actually there's this huge effulgence that's spreading on all sides, and he's seen the glowing form everywhere, wherever he looks. And the form is adorned with various crowns, clubs, discs. So he's seen it in magnified form, Krishna. And Srila Prabhupada writes, just like we've been hearing here, the setting of the scene of these beautiful pastimes in the spiritual world, the first thing in the setting of the scene that you learn is that the demigods are observing the beautiful pastimes. It was mentioned in the class yesterday too. And Srila Prabhupada writes that the demigods took pleasure in that form, even that huge universal form. They took pleasure in that form, but the demons and atheists could not stand it when the Lord was praised. That was their problem. They couldn't stand it when he was praised. And Arjuna expresses this really well. He says, "O master of the senses, the world becomes joyful upon hearing your name, and thus everyone becomes attached to you. Although the perfected beings offer you their respectful homage, the demons are afraid and they flee here and there. All this is rightly done." So, this is Bhagavad Gita 11:35. So this insight that Arjuna has, it's got relevance even in this current situation where we're looking at Chanura making some expression. Chanura could not tolerate that the audience for the upcoming wrestling match was praising Krishna so highly. It's very similar to the moment when Krishna is displaying his universal form with his numerous crowns, his extraordinary effulgence. The demons, their problem was they couldn't stand it that Krishna was being praised, or the universal form of Krishna was being praised. Same thing here. Chanura couldn't tolerate it, that the upcoming match is there and the audience is praising Krishna. In fact, they go into streams of all his various pastimes of having annihilated various demoniac entities. And Chanura is falling in that same category of beings. So he can't tolerate it. And so the statements that are under consideration today certainly appear accurate in terms of the reality of Lord Krishna and Balaram as being joyful in herding their cows in the various forests. Yet at the same time, these statements are being uttered by one of those persons in the category of those not being able to share, or they can't stand the praise of Krishna and Balaram. So therefore, you look at the statement and you have to pause. And that's mentioned in the purport, that here Chanura explains how the two brothers came to be expert at wrestling. Indeed, he did that, but we have to understand what his position is. He can't stand the praise of Krishna and Balaram. So Srila Baladev Vidyabhusan, he gives an explanation for Arjuna saying, all this is rightly done, meaning Krishna has got the correct position of his particular way of dealing with devotees and his particular way of dealing with demons. So here's Srila Baladev Vidyabhusan explaining something of why Arjuna's statement, all this is rightly done, why it's got so much correctness to it. So, this is Srila Baladev Vidyabhusan. He says, "O Hrishikesh, you are the one who inspires the senses towards or against you." So reactions are very clear. It's either towards Krishna or against him. The nature of these senses is either to be attracted to or repulsed by an object. That's every sense we have. We're either attracted to something or we're repulsed by it. So There may be, let me think, some persons will actually find milk very attractive. Other persons will be a bit repulsed by milk. Like I had in New York, when I was living in New York, there was somebody I knew who did production on movie sets, and this person was convinced that milk was the bane of society. So for him, cow's milk was the cause of disease. Because, there is a mucus-forming property in milk, but if you prepare it correctly by adding cardamom or cinnamon, that stops that mucus-forming property. So he was just taking it, milk is the bane of society. This was his utterance because of that mucus-forming property, so therefore you avoid milk. But others will understand milk actually nourishes the finer tissues of the brain, so it's actually completely essential for excellent mental functioning. So that's how the senses work. The mind understands things in a particular way, so the sense of sight sees that thing that or object that is either the mind is understanding to be attractive or repulsive, and then responds accordingly, pulls away or goes towards. So rightly, the universe, this is Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan giving this explanation, rightly the universe, headed by the Devas, the Gandharvas, the Siddhas, and the Vidyaharas, are inclined favorably to you, meaning Krishna, are pleased with and attracted to this glorious form which destroys the wicked. It is also fitting that those of wicked nature, those opposed to you, such as the Rakshasas, the Asuras, and that's Chanara, he's an Asura, and Danavas, are afraid of this form, praised by the Devas. This takes place because you show an appropriate form corresponding to the nature of the living entity. So what takes place is that the Asuras, the Danavas, and the Rakshasas, they flee. And the explanation given by Srila Baladev Vijayabhusan, this takes place because you show an appropriate form corresponding to the nature of the living entity. So the nature of the living entity is what dictates their response to Krishna. Now, the particular material nature of a living entity shows itself in the different bodies and the senses of the particular living entity. So these bodies and senses, they arise or are created by material nature, and that is according to the different sensual pleasure that the particular entity derives. So we have the very common picture that sometimes when book tables are set up, people gravitate towards the picture where you see half a girl's face and the other half is either a boar or a bear. So people are kind of a little bit startled by that picture or painting. And this is explained by the fact that that particular new form that's taken on is coming because of the sensual pleasure that that particular entity was deriving in this life. So if the sensual pleasure is spending many hours sleeping, 12, 13 hours sleeping, it's more appropriate to be in a form that is perfect for sleeping a lot, hence a nice furry form that, can withstand the cold. You don't have to worry about blankets or anything. You have your nice fur coat and you can sleep a lot, no problem. And there's a good amount of bodily fat that keeps you insulated, no problem. Nature provides you with the perfect form because that's your sensual pleasure. So something like that. So coming to reside within a particular body, one comes to experience different kinds of happiness or distress. So naturally, the bear will get its happiness by suddenly coming across a hive of bees, it can actually reach in and get some honey. So that's the happiness the bear is going to experience. Of course, there may be the distress that the bees all try to attack him back. So I don't know how well a bear does with bee stings. I haven't read, but that'll be some of the possible distress. Now, Srila Prabhupada puts it that each entity is struggling very hard to acquire different pleasure for the body. That's actually the motivating force. One's looking for how one's going to get pleasure for one's body. So I will share, I'm in a female body, and I've been aware that it's almost inbuilt in the body that I have to look at beautiful clothes. So I have to consider clothes, because this is what gives pleasure to this particular body. So naturally, I've tempered that and weaned it through practicing Krishna consciousness, but that's part of what comes with the body. One looks for the things that will give pleasure to one's particular body, meaning with the particular mind one has, with the particular senses. So in some cases, one's body may be built to get pleasure out of beautiful sounds, or a body that will get pleasure out of, constructing things. So different ways. So this is how in Bhagavad Gita 13.2 there's an explanation. Nature is the cause of all material causes and effects. So that nature that one has, it's actually what brings about a particular cause, or it's a cause of something and produces an effect. So we're discussing something of that. But whereas, and this is continuing in Bhagavad Gita 13:21, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments of this world. So you're looking for that particular essential pleasure according to the body you have. So material nature provides the correct kind of body for that particular essential pleasure that one practices through one's life. And then the way one starts to act brings about the various suffering and various enjoyments. So, for instance, well, I know that 2 persons have come to live in the temple, so say because I happened to be standing up in the Prasadam hall yesterday, because there's a need to assess the space for an upcoming event. So I hear musical notes and sounds coming. So then I can understand certain persons here get enjoyment from sounds. And if that is restricted, then naturally there may be suffering because that's part of what comes with the body. So here's the particular verse 13.2 in Bhagavad Gita. Karyam karana kartrive hetu prakritir uchate purda sukha dukhanam bhaktritve hetur uchate. So Chanura, he concludes with words that that will acquire pleasure for his body. So we just heard and we analyzed his first statement. Here is his second statement. He reaches a conclusion. And these words will bring pleasure to his body because he's using his senses to achieve an action. So his sense of speech, he used it in a particular way because he wants to come and get his particular sensual pleasure. So he says, therefore, let's do what the king wants. Everyone will be pleased with us, for the king embodies all living entities. So as a wrestler, his nature is to fight an opponent. Now, generally, what a wrestler does, he engages in hand-to-hand combat. And he has to try to force his opponent to the ground without striking blows. That's the interesting part. So there's a certain element of restraint that a wrestler has. You can't just knock somebody out. You have to engage in that combat and try and force them to the ground without hitting them. So, there's that fighting spirit, but you have to control it. It just has to be through strength that you bring your opponent to the ground. So he's trying to bring about this wrestling, but the utterance is not truthful, because his pleasing the king is to follow the order of the king. So King Kamsa is the person in question here. And the order that was given by King Kamsa to Chanura was the following. Rama and Krishna, the sons of Anakundubi, are living in Nanda's cowherd village. It has been predicted that these two boys will be the cause of my death. When they are brought here, kill them on the pretext of engaging them in a wrestling match. So whatever he's saying, he's wanting to bring about a fight, but it's not that he's saying, you also please the king by engaging in this fight. He actually wants to please Kamsa by following Kamsa's order, and Kamsa's order was to kill Krishna and Balaram. And that is not what a wrestler does. A wrestler is restraining his fighting sense, and he's just fighting to bring the opponent to the ground. But he's been instructed he must actually kill the two boys. So, in this sense, you could say that Chanura, as the jiva, the spirit soul, he's the principal cause because he's presiding over material nature. So you could say he's the cause of the action, that there's going to be a fight, because he's using his intention to kill Krishna and Balaram. So as the jiva, he's got that intention. He wants to kill Krishna and Balaram. So that's what the atheist does, or the asura does. They actually want to kill the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So you could say that the soul within the body is acting to bring about the result of some activity. So that's how he's impelled, because of his nature, demoniac nature. Now, of course, Krishna, in the end, has to be accepted as the doer of or the cause of all causes, since he's acting as a super soul within the heart. So he's inspiring some of these statements, and he's inspiring this particular entity to want to behave in this particular way, to fulfill this order of the king. Krishna is going to get an opportunity to have a little bit of a wrestling match with him, and that's part of his pastime and enjoyment. So this deceitfulness, this hypocrisy that's there on the part of Chanura, it's part of a culture, or what gives nourishment to a substrate of ignorance within a living entity. Like for instance, I mean, this is maybe a sensitive topic, but we generally are exposed to, because we live in a democracy, there's a lot of sharing of the thinking process of the persons who are leading the country. So it will be the president will broadcast, a speech will be broadcast where he addresses the nation, and he may speak about his course of action, in relation to other countries, in relation to an epidemic, whatever it is. And that same speech will then be analyzed by different political analysts, and persons will look at, what the motives may be of the president. They will look at what he may have been considering. So because persons are there to expand the understanding of the general public, because we live in a democracy. So therefore we have a right to explore what the leader says, his thinking process. And if the leader happens to be a person who is somewhat hypocritical, or perhaps even there isn't complete integrity, and this was something that was questioned in our previous president, then it actually gives nourishment to a whole culture of ignorance. So hence we found in the last particular situation, just by the leader uttering inflammatory statements, it's mobilized a whole force of people with, the culture of ignorance to then, start to storm the Capitol very mindlessly. So there's that kind of thing. So it's really quite a dangerous thing where hypocrisy and deceitfulness is present. And I'm highlighting this because there's underlying Chanura's words is that hypocrisy and deceitfulness. And this you can contrast with that which brings improvement, or the culture of knowledge. And this is something you can read in Mantra 10 of Sri Upanishad. And this is how it's put in Mantra 10. The wise have explained to us that one result is derived from the culture of knowledge, and it is said that a different result is obtained from the culture of nations. So by contrast with Chanura's feeding of ignorance, that which brings improvement to one's action, meaning that one can use one's body, one's various senses, the many different kinds of endeavoring, and even following the direction of the supersoul, are the following. So this is listed in Sri Upanishad. So this is complete contrast. It's what brings improvement. So the culture of knowledge. Here it is. One can learn to give proper respect to persons other than himself. One can learn to avoid duplicity in his dealings with others. One can learn forbearance, even if there is provocation from others. One should not falsely identify himself with the material covering of the gross body, and one can become fixed in the tenets of the revealed scriptures. So that would be how one can actually go on the path of the culture of knowledge, as opposed to the culture of ignorance, beginning with deceit and hypocrisy. So these are some thoughts on these two verses. If there's any comments, thoughts, questions.
Thank you, Krsnarcana. I think it's very relevant, this last point that you made in terms of the contrast of this culture of nations and culture of knowledge. And it's quite in display in this narration, this part of the pastimes of Krishna. The contrast of having side by side these two cultures and expressing themselves and directing themselves to Krishna. So it's nice that you highlighted that, I think. And in one sense, is something that we don't only sometimes have to face externally, but also we have to face internally, that there is a struggle in one sense of nations and knowledge. And if you can maybe, say some talks on that aspect, the internal part that one have to do in counteracting certain propensities that goes against knowledge,
It's quite a broad question. Well, it's very interesting. Even, particularly maybe because this is very much highlighted in these statements of Chanura, this particular cultivation, let's take one of them. Say, learning to avoid duplicity in his dealings with others. So that's cultivating knowledge, as opposed to ignorance, where you're actually indulging in duplicity. So one can actually even see this playing out in devotional life. And so in certain cultures, one will be trained to always present the positive. So a culture may train one that one is never allowed to say no. So one will say yes, even if internally one thinks no. So this ends up actually wearing on the integrity of a person. That cultural training is to the detriment of the person in the end, because it will appear to facilitate relationships, because the person will always be externally agreeing with the others or externally appearing to, blend in, facilitate, appearing to, but internally the person may have a great deal of conflict, may not be actually quite comfortable with certain things, either the course of an action, or a person may not be comfortable with even working with certain persons. So part of practicing Krishna consciousness and this culture of knowledge is that one is honest with oneself. So one actually has to acknowledge what emotions are emerging in the mind. So, and then one also has to be objective enough to understand if the emotions have validity in the present, or whether they're things that have got mixed up with past experiences. If one can truly say, it's true, in the present moment, I have discomfort working with these people, or I have discomfort with this particular decision. So one also has to understand that part of the conflict one's experiencing may be cultural. I can't speak that I'm not comfortable with this. I can't say I prefer not to do this course of action, because one's culture has forced one to say yes, yes to everything. So that honesty to oneself is essential. One has to then, with intelligence, say, I'm opposed to this particular action because, and one has to be very rational, and it has to make sense. It has to make sense for oneself. And then one has to be able to articulate that to the relevant individual where it's necessary. So that personal integrity is essential in spiritual life, both with learning to avoid duplicity, both for learning to have proper respect for others. It's not just a feigned respect. Even being able to withstand being provoked by others. If one's practicing this internal integrity, one is in a very strong position, because even if one is unhappy, even if one is feeling angry, one can acknowledge it to oneself. It puts one in a very strong position, because it's an honest position. From there, you can choose your course of action. You can actually take remedial measures. You can find ways of healthy outlet for it. You can receive assistance for making your situation different. So that, I would say, is the fundamental, what would be the word? Fundamental acknowledgement that's needed, an honest internal assessment. That is a thought. Jitendra.
I was thinking of that one phrase, man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And in the first canto, chapter 3, the last verse of the Bhagavatam, verse 44, I always like this, Prabhupada, the last part of the purport for the chapter. It says, the secret of knowing the Bhagavatam is mentioned here. No one can give rapt attention who is not pure in mind. No one can be pure in mind who is not pure in action. No one can be pure in action who is not pure in eating, sleeping, fearing, and mating. But somehow or other, if someone hears with rapt attention from the right person at the beginning, one can assuredly see Lord Krishna in person in the pages of the Bhagavatam.
Oh, that's very wonderful. And indeed, Jitendra Prabhu, that's touching on two other statements that are made in the same Ishopanishad verse for cultivating this culture of knowledge. It's that one is actually following the regulative principles, and that one is actually referencing one's spiritual master and asking questions of one's spiritual master. And that is what's giving that, clarity, which I think that's what's been highlighted there. Thank you so much for reading that. It's very beautiful.
Submissive oral reception.
Yes. Which is not easy unless one is, again, very honest in every way possible. One's habits, which is what that verse is, what that purport of Srila Prabhupada is highlighting, that honesty is coming from the purity of the way one is arranging one's life. So following proper procedures of cleanliness and restraint is a very good foundation. And of course, a connection to the spiritual master. So if one doesn't have a spiritual master, one certainly should be taking shelter of Srila Prabhupada. Because he bestows his kindness upon one, that there's some clarity of thought.
To those who think they're intelligent, they're really a burden for those of us who are.
Yes, there's a big difference between what is reality and what isn't reality, yes.
A word to the wise is sufficient, but there's no end to the words needed to convince a fool. Probably heard that one before. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purports of the first canto, third chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Krishna is the source of all incarnations. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Ending on that very nice note. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.